Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders, 2025 Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner for Best Podcast. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
So, Chris, when you think about New Mexico or you're describing it to somebody who maybe doesn't live here, isn't from New Mexico, would you ever describe us as a hub for the tech industry or a key player in the, quote, space economy?
Well, I guess I should first say that I've never worked in those areas, so to truly feel like I'm an expert in that, you're putting me on the spot. But I can at least say that in the 12 years I've been here, I've gotten a sense that New Mexico has tried to continue to grow into that region. And then we also know that there are a lot of really bright minds here in science and technology who traditionally, have worked for the labs and components of the Air Force Base. And so I know there's folks here who've got some pretty big degrees and could do that work. And that it seems to be an area that's being invested in.
Yeah, it seems like your answer is taking into account the episode that we're doing. But I got to say, right. When I explain New Mexico to people who aren't from here, I don't necessarily say, oh, yeah, we're a tech hub. It's not how I would describe our state. Yeah. I don't know why, but I am excited for today's conversation because I think we will learn a lot from our guests. Joining us in studio are Gabe Mounce, Director of the Tech Engagement Office with the Air Force Research Lab, New Mexico, and also Matthew Fetrow, Senior Scientist with the U.S. Space Force and Communications Directors for Space Force Rapid Capabilities Office here in New Mexico. Big titles. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us,
Yeah.
When Chris and I did an episode about what goes on at Kirtland Air Force Base, I feel like that was sort of the catalyst that launched us into this topic. Yeah, we can link to that episode in our show notes for people who haven't listened. But we asked a couple of questions about the Space Force, and today we're going to go straight to the source with you two. Gabe, let's start with you. I watched your TED Talk, which I kind of alluded to in the top of my question to Chris there. Very interesting. You mentioned that you wanted to pursue a career in space from a young age and thought the sky's not the limit. So explain that for us. What did you mean by that? And what was the catalyst for you as a kid?
Yeah, so, I grew up down in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Like I said in the TED Talk, if you see that, I'm kind of repeating that here, but I always wanted to be an astronaut. And at the time, it seemed like the best way to do that was to get into the U.S. Air Force. Then later, I went on to New Mexico State to get my engineering degree. The Air Force paid for me to go to school, which was amazing. And then I was commissioned into the Air Force as an active duty officer for a while. Long story short, I landed back here in Albuquerque. I left active duty and got picked up at the Air Force Research Lab as a civil servant. And then when the U.S. Space Force stood up in 2019, most of us that were working in the space sector, the space part of the Air Force Research Lab, we automatically became new Space Force Guardians, right? Which is the name for all of the people that are in the U.S. Space Force, whether that be military, civilian, or otherwise. So much like you have airmen for the Air Force, or you have sailors for the Navy, the Guardians are the nomenclature for what we are in the U.S. Space Force.
Yeah. And Matt, same thing as well. What ultimately launched you into this career field?
For me, it was a little bit more serendipity. I went to school in Utah at a university that does a lot of space research, and so I was super fortunate, even as an undergraduate, to get an internship, really, research assistantship, I guess they call it, to study space while I was going to school, which also helped pay for tuition, things like that, which was super important. And so that's a long time ago now. I've been in the really space technology business ever since, mostly with the Air Force at the time, and really started at Kirtland at the Air Force Research Lab, where Gabe is now, almost 30 years ago. So a long time ago before transitioning to the Space Force when that service stood up.
Wow, that's cool. For those who aren't familiar, let's just ask you guys, what exactly is the mission of the U.S. Space Force? Why is it necessary to have this separate military branch focused on space?
Yeah, so what's been happening over the last many years is that the U.S. Air Force was the main service that took care of all of our space assets, operated those assets to kind of help what would normally be the other domains, air, land, and sea, and how we do operations and conduct missions. But it's starting to be where, and there's a lot of economics surrounding this as to why there are a lot of other private companies and nation states that are putting things into orbit. So the Space Force was really stood up to help contend with what is now becoming a congested, what we often say a congested and contested domain. And now in particular, our adversaries are really exploiting that new domain. So we are now facing a whole new paradigm where we're having to start basically prosecuting warfare in space. So the Space Force was stood up specifically as a new service to kind of enable that to happen.
Yeah, and I think to your point as well, we've just seen space evolve over the last many decades from purely a governmental thing to really a lot of private interests are now central to what happens out there. If you can maybe either one of you explain what parts of the U.S. Space Force are based here in Albuquerque, and why does our region play an important role in the national security mission there?
Yeah, so even at Kirtland Air Force Base, there are, I'm counting in my head as we're talking, Chris, 4 or 5 different entities that are Space Force units. Let me talk about my own briefly. The one I work for is the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, and we're a unit of the Space Force that acquires and delivers systems, equipment, if you will. We purchase that from industry, and we deliver that to those Space Force Guardians so they can operate those missions. So, for example, we buy satellites, we buy ground systems, all the innovative equipment that our operators will need to be successful and efficient in their jobs. Other units on base include another group like mine called Space Systems Command. There's the Air Force Research Lab. They do the more basic research about space and space technology. That's just to name a few. Overall, I have said to others, I think I haven't counted it, on my fingers, but I think there's over 1,000 folks, is my guess, supporting the Space Force at Kirtland.
Okay.
Wow. And so I asked Chris, if you'd consider New Mexico a tech hub or a key player in the space economy. Gabe, can you tell us how you feel about those descriptions for New Mexico, and why do you think that is lost on a lot of people who live here?
Yeah, I mean, New Mexico has a long history in space. I think most people know, and if they don't, right, some of the very first rocket experiments happened right here in New Mexico at Roswell, New Mexico. And then Kirtland itself, right, since World War II, has always had an element where they've done things like high-altitude balloon experiments and other things that were kind of the precursor to what was happening when it came to science and tech in space. So really the foundational government investment in what I would call space science and technology happened right here and has been happening right here for a long time. More recently, what's been happening is the private sector, the commercial sector, is opening up that because we have companies like SpaceX, right, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, other pioneers that were private sector, right, not funded by the government necessarily, that enabled a lot quicker access to space and a lot cheaper access to space, which means now you have this whole private sector rushing in to kind of, make money, but to do some new things in space that we haven't seen before. And because of the underpinning of all that science and tech from the government, especially from the DoD side, what we call national security space side, now culminating the U.S. Space Force here in the region, it's becoming an attraction for that space sector to be here right next to the Space Force so that we can both take it. So, for us, it's great because we can take advantage of all that new economic energy. But what they get out of it is a lot of expertise that's been invested in for a long time to drive this new sector. And it's just mutually beneficial. And that's why this is really, really attractive. And we see, in my opinion, the economy here growing because of that. We're seeing a lot of new companies crop up, and both organic and from outside coming here to kind of be in our neighborhood.
Yeah, certainly. And we've seen a lot of the headlines around that, particularly you mentioned Virgin Galactic having really done quite a bit over the last few years to get going on what it hopes are continual launches for space tourism, as they say. Matt, I wanted to ask you about one of the things that you mentioned real briefly here so we could talk a little bit more about it. Can you tell us about the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, or the Space RCO? It sounds like you do a lot of work there. And what do you do with them? And again, what exactly do they do? How do you explain that?
Again, it's kind of funny to explain what we do because we're essentially buying innovative technology, innovative systems for those Space Force operators to do their job with. And so we in our office have only about 300 people, a mixture of military members, civilians like myself, and a great team of support contractors that take requirements from the Space Force, right? We need a new satellite, we need a better ground antenna, something like that, and go out and find those industry partners that have the latest, best technology and contract with those to get those systems developed. We then work with the rest of the Space Force and really the rest of the Department of Defense to get those systems fielded, right? It's one thing to buy it, but you also have to train against it. You've got to test those systems to make sure they're going to work just the way that they were intended. And so we partner with all those other government agencies to get that work done. Our sort of claim to fame, because we're not the only folks that buy stuff for the Space Force, but at Space RCO, our big push is that we've got special authorities and a streamlined acquisition approach that really lets us do things more rapidly. So we typically get those jobs, and this is really, again, back to why we're in New Mexico, those jobs that require innovation or doing things a little bit differently than maybe has been done before. I'll give you one example, Chris. We're working on a new system for talking to satellites, right? The satellites have to communicate to the ground. They do that through radio signals back and forth. And that's been going on for since the 50s. But we're developing a new set of antennas. They're called SCAR, Satellite Communications Augmentation Resource.
Resource. Okay.
You got to love government acronyms, right?
So many of them.
It's just a very different way of doing that same old job. Right now we're using these really large electronically steerable arrays with modern technology, and allows a lot more flexibility and a lot more choices for the operators. And just to continue that thought, those are being built by the company AV, formerly Blue Halo, and they're being done right here in Albuquerque over on Eubank. And so that's just one example of the kind of innovation that Space RCO is becoming known for, and why we're so pleased to be in this state, right, in Albuquerque, where we can tap into those companies, the talent that's on the base and off the base, our research universities, to get that mission done.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
And a follow-up on that, I mean, the companies, how many of those companies are you finding here? And it sounds like the size of those companies may be pretty small, like just a couple people working on some really amazingly high-tech specialized stuff. Am I reading that right?
I think there are other markets, there are other cities that have maybe those bigger companies that you might have heard of before. You know, Gabe mentioned SpaceX, Blue Origin. They don't have a big presence here. They're in other markets, but we do have a growing number of really interesting, innovative companies. You know, AV or Blue Halo is maybe one of the largest. I can mention Veris. I can mention a number of others that are smaller for that kind of defense space work, but they're still significant economic, drivers within our market, and they're producing really amazing stuff.
Do you all commission those companies to build you a specific type of tool?
We do.
Okay.
We do. It's through a contract system, but yes.
Okay.
I like to say Space RCO, I'm a scientist with the organization. Like we develop things. We don't do that. We don't have labs and facilities. We contract with those great industry partners to get that technology developed.
Okay. So providing things like satellites, antennas, software for the Department of Defense, those can help prevent other countries from using their space systems to target our military, for example. Can you explain how other countries could potentially use their own space systems to target our military, and why are those protections so important?
Yeah, I was going to go back and first maybe explain, I'll get to that answer in kind of this long-winded way to explain the life cycle against what he just said when they're procuring systems, right? They're buying systems. At the Air Force Research Lab, we're on the opposite end of that spectrum, right? We are the science and tech arm for the Department of the Air Force, includes Air Force and Space Force. And so inside the lab, we're kind of creating technology and advancing it, advancing the science, advancing the technology that will then eventually transfer into the commercial sector. A lot of times we call that commercialization. That's kind of exactly how this process works, right? We don't really take that body of evidence and that body of scientific research and necessarily hand it right to the buyer. It has to get integrated. It has to get somehow created, and industry is the best way to do that. So we have to transfer it into the industry sector. And then what happens is then the other parts of the spectrum, like the Space RCO, in some cases can take what the companies are providing, right? They cobble together, that's probably not the best way to say it, but they integrate some of these piece parts that kind of come out of the research lab and then put it back together in a way that then places like the Space Systems Command or the Space RCO can then procure to go into orbit or however we're deploying it. But the same goes now for everybody, right? This thing is international because of that, again, that cheap cost to launch capability into orbit. Anybody can do this that has the right, maybe not anybody, but if you have the right billfold with the right amount of cash, you can probably find a way to develop a system and get it into orbit because it's so cheap. And so in the international sphere, right, that means private companies are doing this all on their own for whatever they want to do with it. And that's great. We love that. I mean, in the capitalist way we do business, that's actually fantastic for us when that happens. But that means our adversaries have access to all of that same capability, right? So anything that has to do with advanced algorithms that help then maybe autonomy for space systems, right? Anybody can deploy those. So our systems, like the GPS systems, right, we need to make sure that those are resilient against what perhaps these other adversaries are doing to exploit the new technology against us. And so we're now in this state where we're trying to constantly advance that and deploy that as quickly as we can.
Can you give us like a real example of how that can be dangerous?
Yeah, so our military, other countries' militaries typically take advantage of space in, say 3 ways. Communications, right? It allows worldwide communication so you can pass information to your allies and back to your government. Surveillance, right? You can take pictures of people from space, which is kind of amazing. And then things like position, navigation, and timing, so you can tell where you are. And so communications is one where Space RCO has developed a system called RMT. I won't remember what that's for either, right? And it's really a communications jammer, right? And it's an antenna system that we've developed and is starting to be deployed that will send out a signal and deny temporarily other countries from using their communication system. So if a country wanted to, for example, upload drone data on U.S. troop movements and use satellites to maybe transmit that back to their home base, we could selectively use our antennas to deny them the ability to do that. So that's when we mean, denying them the ability to target our troops. In that case, I used in a time of crisis.
Wow. Yeah. And I think we talked a little bit about this, but just to get a little bit more into the idea of, relying on the private sector to an extent here. Matt, you mentioned relying on research and innovation as well from universities and other industry members. How do each of you scout, though, for promising companies, and what makes a technology a good fit for national security use?
Well, Gabe is an expert in scouting for this. He's come up with a whole bunch of programs that the Air Force Research Lab leads, and Space RCO and other acquisition folks take advantage of. So I'll let him describe a few of those programs.
Yeah, so what we've been doing over the last several years, in fact, Matt was part of my team for a while before he went to work for the Space RCO when we kind of pioneered these ideas. The first kind of concept was use something called a lean startup accelerator. A lot of startup companies, venture-backed startup companies like you hear about in Silicon Valley, are all about innovating to kind of quickly grow their companies, to quickly provide value. And it turned out that if you use that same model to help companies understand what not just their market is, but what is their market with the government, can we utilize this same technology for ourselves? That would be very helpful and speed up the way we could access this technology. So we created a number of programs, right? So I have a number of funded programs, funded agreements with partners here, mainly in the state of New Mexico, that helps us do those scouting. The 2 main ones that we call the Space Force Accelerator program are, there's one in Colorado, it's called the Catalyst Space Accelerator, and then the Hyperspace Challenge. Those are kind of more traditional lean startup accelerators that are actually helping these companies understand what are the mission needs that the Space Force cares about. And then we do some of that programming through some of our incubators, right? We have a few facilities that are both kind of our collaboration spaces to help us collaborate with the private sector. We have one in Nob Hill called the Q Station, which is our flagship kind of front door program. And the Hyperspace Challenge kind of takes advantage of that hub in order to kind of create those collaborations. They're becoming more of an innovation navigator to kind of help them then plug into the other elements of this ecosystem, right? We have a lot of great partners through these kind of funded agreements to kind of work through, like the New Mexico Tech Council, for instance, the universities. And then we have another facility called the Launchpad, run by New Space Nexus and their Igniter program. And they're helping really dive into the company's technology and try and enable them to advance that technology to the next state so that they can then get the investment they need to grow as a company. And together, kind of this landscape of things that help us just really look at what are the commercial guys doing and how do they fit with what the government cares about. And I have a classic example I use if you want me to use it, or we can have you answer the question. My classic example, I shouldn't say classic. That makes it sound old, and it's not old. It's amazing.
All of this is new sounding to a lot of us.
We ran one of our accelerators. I think it was 21 that we ran the Hyperspace Challenge around a number of problem sets. One of them was how do we predict when a satellite is going to fail, right? Or how do you better monitor the health of a satellite? And as you can imagine, that's really important because it's an object that's remote in orbit. We can't access it. Despite the fact that we have an international space station, we do not have enough yet capability for astronauts to be fixing satellites. Yet. Maybe. Yes. We'll see in the future. But these things are kind of remote objects that once they are deployed, they're there. And if they fail, they're done, right? Yeah. There's nothing you can really do to fix that. So a lot of the operators for spacecraft want to understand if something is going to fail beforehand so that they can mitigate that risk. And lo and behold, through this accelerator, we discovered this company called RS-21, local company here. The team comes out of Sandia National Labs. Charles Rath is the CEO, and what they provided to us is that they do a lot of big data analytics and algorithm work. And they had this amazing one that was really made for the oncology sector, really to predict the onset of cancer in patients, oncology patients. And it turns out, through the accelerator program, we discovered that they could apply that same algorithm to a spacecraft. And no kidding, as they went through, essentially, we kicked the tires of that algorithm with Space Force operators and determined that, no kidding, using some past data from a satellite that actually failed, if you ran their algorithm, they, no kidding, could determine what component of that satellite was going to fail using this oncology algorithm. Wow. So it was an amazing kind of mapping of finding a company who had no space business at all, wasn't even going to be a space company, that then now is pursuing a whole new line of business because of this kind of scouting mechanism.
Wow.
When you made that link, I mean, what was that like?
How did you make that link, though? Yeah.
Yeah, we have, when we go and advertise the program and ask people to apply for it, that's partly the scouting mechanism, is we publicize, we're looking for companies that are doing this thing. And we're not confining it to, we try to make the language such that it's very agnostic to space. We're not necessarily telling them we're looking at a space application per se. And the reason is I want to look for technology that might be completely out of the box from what I might normally have from a space company. And then that advertisement just allows companies to determine, am I working on something that might be interesting for a spacecraft or a space user? That's kind of how it works.
Yeah, I mean, it's just got to be amazing when you see that someone's application being used for one thing get used for something entirely different that can make a world of a difference in that industry.
Yeah.
So those programs have been super successful at really finding. That's just one example of many Gabe could have picked. The challenge we've had on the acquisition side, now equipping the Space Force when we're actually procuring some of this stuff, is now kind of coming into two areas. One has been making sure that that technology is sufficiently mature, that if I end up buying that technology, operators can count on it, right? These are guardians that are doing super important missions, for the Department of Defense, right? They need to be able to really count on it. So there's a level of technology maturity that we have to be super comfortable with. And then the other thing that we've been working on through some other kinds of accelerators with Gabe and his team is this idea of integration. So you mentioned algorithms, and the RS-21 one is great. But again, I'm not buying an algorithm. I need to buy a complete software system, or maybe a hardware software system, right? A satellite with those algorithms built in. And so we're working on ways to, how do you aggregate that together so we can get a number of companies to partner, or one big company to select a lot of little companies so that they give Space RCO, in this case, a complete solution. Because as I joked, right, I don't have people that can put algorithms, inside satellites at our offices, right? We don't do that kind of work. We work with industry to get that done. And so that's sort of some of the challenges we're working on now.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcasts and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
We hear a lot, about Silicon Valley, but Gabe, you're helping build a Space Valley coalition also right here in New Mexico. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, I appreciate that you mention it as me being part of it or helping, I guess. Let me be clear that some of the partners that we help to underwrite, I named a few of them, and that also includes the universities, CNM Ingenuity, for instance, UNM, NMSU, New Mexico Tech, all of them. They have decided together, kind of their own, to enable and promote this region as a space valley, meaning just like Silicon Valley. Is this a region for economic development and to grow the economy? And more talking about space as a domain of commerce. And so that whole thing, we are contributors to it for sure. We're very much fans of what those private sector entities are doing. I wouldn't say that we're necessarily the ones driving it. That's not us. They're doing it, and I'm really, really proud of all of the people working that. But it's becoming this corridor, the Space Valley corridor. Depends on who you talk to. But if you talk to the director of the Space Valley Foundation, he would say it extends from Colorado Springs all the way down to UTEP, kind of along the Rio Grande corridor. And all of the entities along that corridor that are doing aerospace or building aerospace and providing kind of science and tech support, that's the reason it's kind of this new corridor that we think is like Silicon Valley. And it's driving a lot of energy nationally for the attraction of both companies and even, and this is, I would say, thanks to the state of New Mexico, a lot of the capital they're starting to invest in the tech sector, a lot of that into aerospace, is partly why we're seeing kind of this new growth and this new moniker that everyone's calling Space Valley. So Space Valley is for all. Space is for all is what I keep saying. Space is for everybody. It's not just for rocket scientists and engineers. It's for business people. It's for artists. It's for entertainers. It's a whole domain of commerce that I think is good for New Mexico and great for the region.
This is partly why you feel like it's an economic builder.
Yes.
Assuming. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's been pretty clear from our conversation is the amount of irons y'all have in the fire, both of you, in your respective work. One of the goals mentioned, though, in our background research as well is this idea of not only finding these local companies, but international companies to establish U.S. headquarters here in New Mexico and see how others might gain business with the U.S. government. Why is that an important piece of the puzzle, and how receptive really has the global sector been towards, hey, come to America, establish this business, and work with the Space Force and the Air Force here?
Well, one thing I'll kind of point out, and maybe it's obvious, space is very much an international endeavor, almost by its very nature, right? Satellites, almost all cases, go around the entire world, every day or every 90 minutes or whatever. And so it's almost inherently global. And we have seen just a tremendous growth of international technologies as well that are worth, our U.S. military considering using, right? Our U.S. commercial entities as well. And so the accelerators Gabe has been running, the work we do at Space RCO is always tries to be inclusive of those international partners. Sometimes those folks need a U.S. presence to do work with the U.S. government. It just makes things a lot easier or even possible. And so we have seen a lot of interest from foreign companies in siting somewhere in the U.S., and New Mexico has been a pretty attractive place for them. A couple now of Gabe's accelerators have been specifically focused on international companies. and the technology that those companies have has been amazing to me, and I have seen them really be excited about the possibility of coming to New Mexico.
Yeah, I think because there is a lot of capability and innovation, right? Each of the nation states that have an economy that depend on science and tech, right? Many of them are having a whole sector where people are inventing new things and innovation for space. And so in a lot of those companies, right, the U.S. is still the main big market, right? Despite the fact that it is international and other countries are in fact investing some of their economic development dollars, I think, into in their sectors, right? Because they're trying to grow their own things. Right now, the U.S. is still the big behemoth when it comes to this sector, and for that reason, the international companies want to try to extend some kind of presence in the country here, and we think New Mexico is a good place for them to start. And we've seen, especially at the Air Force Research Lab, we have been pioneering some ways to use things, for instance, cooperative research and development agreements, a specific kind of way that we can cooperate and exchange information, exchange expertise. We are starting to see a few more of those crop up with international companies than we have in the past, and I think it's because of all this energy that's going into the worldwide market.
Yeah. Well, I'll mention this one more time because I was just fascinated when you gave a show and tell for your TED Talk. We can link to that also in our show notes if people want to see this video. But you showed just how small some of the satellites are that can, private companies are launching into space. We've got companies, that we've all heard of like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic paving the way into space tourism. First, I want to ask you, though, do you see a thing like space tourism as something that will actually happen in our lifetime? And then also from a military standpoint, what kind of role are these private companies currently playing in global security and conflict?
Right.
Two-part question.
That's a great question. Did you
want to start with space tourism?
I'll let you talk about space tourism. Or we can give our opinions.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, Matt Fetrow's opinion on space tourism, it's tough, right? I don't have a lot of experience in the tourism industry. I had a lot of experience, right, in the government. And, oftentimes people say space is hard, and it really is. And so it's not 100% clear to me how that business model will grow over time, right? Clearly for the very wealthy, it might be a choice, but it'll take a while, and I guess it did on aircraft as well before, common folks, common salaries, for example, can afford tourism. I do think, however, the growth in tourism has really helped energize commercial space. And many, again, I'm a technologist, many of the technologies we've seen that have been applied to the tourism industry are just the same kinds of systems and technologies, one might use for other commercial applications or even government military applications. So I think it's good overall. Again, whether we'll see a lot of tourists 10 or 15 years from now, I don't know, probably some, but it's hard for me to judge exactly how big that market is.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. I've been following Virgin Galactic since before they were Virgin Galactic, for instance, when it was the what's the name of the company that was the previous winners of the X Prize, right?
Yeah, the X Prize was the one that made that aircraft.
Scaled Composites, that's the name of the company. Watching those guys for a long time. I think we're kind of in the area of space. We're in the era of space tourism, right? Because we already see Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. And even SpaceX sending up what amounts to, sort of quasi-tourism. But what I'm also seeing those companies do is enable kind of science and research in some cases. You can contract with those companies to send up things that you might not have otherwise been able to do in the old days when it was just NASA and you had to go to the ISS. So I think that's progressing, and it's blending between space tourism and things that you do to actually drive the sector forward when it comes to science and technology. I think it's probably going to happen more. We are seeing companies like Axiom put up their own private space stations or attempt to. Amazing. That's going to be amazing. If there's more of those, a lot of us enthusiasts in space can't wait for a bigger experimental platform to go into orbit to enable all these other private sectors to do something. And whether that's government or private, who knows? But I think we're right on the cusp of that, and that's why there's so much energy around all this. Yep.
Yeah. So how are those, back to the second part of the question, how are those private companies already key players in global conflict or security?
Well, I mean, one of the main ways is that some of those companies are already, especially the companies that are doing remote sensing, where they're sensing and taking essentially photos of the Earth, those are already augmenting what the Space Force is doing with its own systems. In some cases where we think we need to do things, we go and try to provide, or we request and buy services, right, for certain kinds of applications. So that's already helping.
Well, in communications as well, right? That's something that benefits commercial operators. It's something that governments need as well. And so you're seeing in the Ukraine conflict and in other places, people leaning on commercial satellite services to go ahead and communicate for government purposes. I think you'll see some more of that moving forward. The Space Force has stood up an entire commercial services office looking to not buy equipment like Space RCO does, but just buy, purchase for the government use some of those same services that commercial companies are providing and that other folks are taking advantage of.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's very clear that this is a field that has just grown in leaps and bounds over the last 2 decades here, particularly in that movement into private companies. So many more private companies in this space. Is there one thing that both of you maybe wish more people understood about Space Force's role, not just in national security, but maybe in the local economy here?
I think the one that I think would surprise folks, and I wish they understood, is that there are a lot of Space Force folks, folks working for the Space Force here in New Mexico, up at Kirtland, other places. And I mentioned, 1,000-ish people is my guess. And these aren't all scientists and engineers. These are, again, folks that work in finance, folks in contract, security folks, right? Communicators. And so I think, as Gabe has mentioned, space is growing in New Mexico. We're not the biggest space state yet, but we've got a ton of energy and a ton of momentum coming, I think, through Space Valley and others. And so I think if people, back to your original question, your original comment, if people thought about us as being a space state, not the biggest space state, but a space state, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I think from the Space Force perspective, right, I think it's just simply a matter that all of the capability that the rest of our Department of Defense depends upon when it's in this kind of new era of high technology that is underpinning modern warfare, the Space Force is right there providing capability from and to space to enable all those frontline forces, right? They could not do that function without the U.S. Space Force. And you don't always see it, and that's one of the hard things about space. That's one thing hard about talking about this in the local economy. We're talking about things that you don't necessarily see, but that we all depend on. GPS is one of the most forefront, right? How do we use our phones to map and get where we're going, right? Everybody depends on space. And so Space Force is here doing that mission. Locally, when it comes to space, I think a lot of people perhaps still think of it as a tourism function. That's definitely an element of it, but it is by far not the largest element. The largest element of space is other companies putting satellites in orbit or deriving some other value from satellites in orbit that are purely commercial driven, and that market is much, much bigger than what tourism is about.
Wow.
Well, yeah, it is
we
a
could
lot
probably
to think
spend
about.
a lot more time talking to both of you guys, but we appreciate you breaking down what all of this means to New Mexico and the space economy here locally and obviously beyond New Mexico. Thank you both for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again to Gabe Mounce and Matt Fetrow for that space conversation about the final frontier. Do you know how hard it was for me to not ask them a question about the film Geostorm?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, no, it was very
How
difficult.
hard was it? Were you okay?
Oh, man.
Well, we didn't talk to them about a lot of things that we could have talked about. I mentioned, I asked Gabe if he had gone to space yet, and he said, no, he has not. And at this point, he might be a little bit too nervous to actually go to space, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah. It goes to show you, though, the mortality question, the older you get, and then also just the kind of growing knowledge that you get about what they do out there in space and just how harsh of an environment it is. It is
risky business.
Really risky stuff, and fascinating to learn about the amount of people doing space work here in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Hopefully it was an illuminating thing for y'all as well.
We'll link to some. Gabe sent us a lot of materials to research and prep for this conversation, and we can link to some of those things in our show notes if you're interested in reading more about what they do and watching some of the videos that we mentioned as well. If you all have any story ideas or people you'd like to hear from on our show, always feel free and reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media.
And also leave us a comment on Spotify. You can reach me at chris.mckee@krqe.com, also at Chris McKee TV. Thanks again for watching and listening.